Good day again, students. Now we are down to our second module, and this chapter is entitled Tourism and Poverty Alleviation or Poverty Elimination. So we have four lessons embedded in this chapter. First, we will discuss the definition and concept of poverty as well as poverty elimination or reduction or alleviation. The second one, we will be discussing the poverty fact sheet here in the Philippines. So we will discuss the ratio of how the current situation of most specifically the people who are residing in rural areas. Then the third lesson would be about tourism and Philippine economy. We will be touching or we will be discussing how tourism is helping our economy. And the last one, the important principles to address poverty through tourism. So this lesson makes students realize the importance of tourism industry in the Philippine economy, from the income generated from primary tourism products until income generated from the auxiliary services to aid tourism industry. Auxiliary services or indirect services. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to define poverty and the concept of poverty reduction. Also, you have to enumerate the facts of poverty information of the Philippines. And you also have to identify the role of tourism in the economy of the Philippines in general. And the last one, explain the principles governing poverty alleviation through tourism. So let's start our chapter 2 with the first lesson. What is poverty? So according to J.G. Goddard, poverty is the insufficient supply of those things which are requisite or required for an individual to maintain himself and those who are dependent on him in health and vigor. So what are those? Those are providing the physiological needs of a person. What are the physiological needs of a person? So let's use the Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The physiological needs of a person would be food, shelter, and clothing. So for poverty alleviation, this means to reduce the poverty from urban and rural areas through employment. Kaya very important na part ng State of the Nation's address ng every president ang report about unemployment and employment rate here in the Philippines. And that's the reason why also na malaking contribution ang naibibigay ng tourism sa employment rate ng Philippines. For example, one hotel na pinatayo, ilan ang kakailanganin nun na empleyado, ilang mga Pilipino ang mabibigyan yun ng trabaho. So, poverty reduction naman is often used as a shorthand for promoting economic growth that will permanently lift as many people as possible over a poverty line. So, but there are many different objectives that are consistent with poverty reduction, and we have to make choices between them. So, poverty reduction, this is more permanent when it comes to its output. So, that's the first lesson. If you have any question or may hindi kayo naintindihan, just drop a message on our group chat sa Facebook. Now, let's go to the Philippine Poverty Fact Sheet. So, this is according to an information from the Philippine Statistics or PSA. And this was from the information the year 2019. So, in 2019, agriculture is the main source of income for rural inhabitants, primarily in farming and fishing. Most farmers and small landholders live in areas that are prone to natural disasters or conflicts. Examples, earthquakes, o kaya mga war, lalo na dito sa Mindanao area natin. Another natural disaster for fishermen would be coral reef bleaching. Ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng coral reef bleaching? Coral reef bleaching is yung pagkamatay or pagpuputi ng mga coral reefs natin. And pag namatay yung mga coral reef natin, nababawasan yung mga fishes. So, ibig sabihin, pag nababawasan yung fishes na naninirahan doon, konti lang din yung na kukuhang mga isda ng mga fishermen natin. Declines in agricultural productivity, unsuccessful small landholder farming operations, and unsustainable practices have caused deforestation and weakened fish stocks. For farming, ang isa sa mga pinakamalaking problema ng mga farmers natin would be the irrigation. Lalong-lalo na that last year, we have experienced one of the worst El Nino, and hanggang ngayon, we are still experiencing, it still feels like summer. Mainit pa rin siya, though we are already approaching to the last quarter of the year. So that's one of the problem. Another example would be irrigation din ang naging problema ng mga rice terraces in mountain province. Dati, they have a natural irrigation system, but right now, they are having a hard time in rehabilitating their irrigation system since nanunuyot na din yung mga irigasyon nila doon. So, another poverty fact would be over a third or more than 1/3 of the rural inhabitants in the Philippines are impoverished or below the poverty line. Indigenous people residing in these areas experience higher rates of illiteracy. So aside from lower or lesser capability for them to access education, if financial resources are concerned, aside from that is yung pagiging accessible ng places in rural areas, medyo mahirap. Another, aside from illiteracy, would be unemployment. So illiteracy plus unemployment, there is a higher possibility to experience poverty. A lack of access to productive capital and limited market access has created slow economic growth in rural areas, which resulted to underemployment. So, kaya nga lagi nating naririnig na kaya nagpupunta sa Manila yung mga, or Metro Manila, yung mga galing probinsya natin because they are actually dreaming of a better life because in the rural areas, wala masyadong mga investors, meaning wala masyadong mga firm na nangangailangan ng tao. The rural poor have limited options for off-farm employment. So most of the employments in rural areas are on-farm or farming lang talaga. Fishing, farming, mga ganon. And low access to inexpensive financial services. So most of the financial services found in rural areas are mostly expensive. Why? Because they have fewer competition or competitors, yung mga financial firms that are actually extending services. Kaya medyo yung prices nila medyo mataas. So that is the law of supply and demand with the price. So another fact would be poverty fact. The majority of poor Filipino households have only achieved basic levels of education. At least 2/3 of poor households are headed by an individual with an elementary level education or worst below. Additionally, most poor families have minimal access to health and education services. Maybe one of the reasons why we have this one is lack of facilities. Wala masyadong mga facilities na kagaya ng nasa urban areas. Wala masyadong facilities na mahahanap sa rural areas na kagaya sa health facilities na kagaya sa urban areas. Another, sa rural areas kasi, nasanay yung mga ninuno natin, the traditional people of the Philippines, yung suburban. So maybe those are some of the reasons why most poor families have minimal access to health and education services. So poverty levels in the Philippines are affected by unrestrained population growth. So that's one of our problem. Kaya nga na open up yung, what do you call this one? Yung contraceptives, because we want to control the population growth here in the Philippines. Kasi isa yon sa mga nagpapahirap or isa yon sa mga nagde-drag down sa mga families, most specifically in urban areas. The average poor family in the Philippines consists of 6 or more members. Similar to other countries, impoverished regions typically have higher birth rates. So, based from studies, mas financially challenged ka daw, mas financially challenging family, mas mataas yung birth rate. In layman's term, mas mahirap, mas madaming anak. So, ganun ang nangyayari dito sa Philippines. And hindi lang naman sa Pilipinas. Other impoverished regions also. In rural areas in the Philippines, the average woman will have 3.8 children compared to the cities where the average woman will have 2.8 only. So another poverty fact here in the Philippines, 4 out of 10 poor families in urban naman to, in cities, in urban areas, do not have decent living conditions. Yun yung mga tumitira sa mga slum areas, o mga squatters. Most of the poor households in urban areas reside as informal settlements in slum areas of major cities like Manila in Tondo. These homes do not include proper facilities and also are bad for the environment. Ang slum areas kasi, most specifically in Manila, they reside along rivers. Specifically, kaya madumi ang Pasig River kasi dumadaan yan sa Santa Ana. Santa Ana is one of the slum areas or has one of the slum areas here in the Philippines. So dun sila dumudumi dun sa river, or dun din sila naliligo, dun din sila nagtatapon ng kung ano-ano, yung mga garbages nila. So yung chemicals na yon, yung mga garbages na yon, it actually contributes to pollution, land pollution, and water pollution. So these settlers typically move to major cities from other provinces in search of better economic opportunity and livelihood. So babalik ulit tayo dito sa over a third kasi sinasabi dito sa statement na to na wala naman kasing ibang choices. Very limited ang choices ng mga tao from rural areas. Aside from on-farm and fishing, very konti lang talaga yung mga employment opportunities. Kaya sila pumupunta ngayon sa mga urban areas, na doon sa urban areas, nagiging crowded na sila masyado. So the next one, moderate economic growth has not resulted in poverty reduction. Ibig sabihin, hindi kayang tapatan ng economic growth na nararamdaman ng Pilipinas yung pangangailangan ng mga poor people, kaya hindi natin na-achieve yung poverty reduction. So the average annual GDP, by the way, GDP is gross domestic product. Ibig sabihin yan, this is the monetary value of all finished products and services made within the Philippines for a specific time. So for 1 year, let's say for 1 year. So the average annual GDP increased by only 0.63% per person between 1980 and 2005. So ilang years yan? 1980, 1990, 2000. So in 25 years, ang average annual increase lang every year is 0.63